Good morning and good evening to our online participants. Welcome you all to today's webinar on Global Race for Science and Technology Innovation. My name is Nong Hong. I am the Executive Director of the Institute for China-America Studies, which is an independent think tank based in Washington, D.C., focusing on research on many of the key issues affecting or concerning U.S.-China general relations. This webinar is co-organized by ICAS and China program of Carter Center. It is also a part of our China-U.S. Canada Trilateral Relations Roundtable series, which was launched in 2019 by ICAS in close collaboration with Carter Center and the China Institute at the University of Alberta. The competition over advanced technology, especially in the cutting-edge sectors like 5G and intelligence, artificial intelligence, has become a matter of national security for a lot of countries and also become a hot topic for the U.S.-China relations. And technology competition itself is nothing particularly new, but what made today's competition unique is the greater emphasis that placed in obtaining economic leaderships. So under this background and also taking this opportunity, I'm happy to announce that ICAS officially launched our trade and technology program today. As you can see from the slides, the goal of this program is to analyze the evolving dynamic of U.S.-China trade and technology affairs, and also provide a timely product on issues involving the development and expand our public dialogue surrounding this critical and contentious topic. So today's webinar is our first TNT event. We have just released this morning our first dispatch, and we're going to release our first issue brief very soon. Welcome to explore our various featured projects from our website. This panel will be moderated by Dr. Liu Yawei. Dr. Liu is the Director of China Program at Carter Center. He has written substantially on the U.S.-China relations and facilitate a lot of discussion and debates on these very critical bilateral relations. Dr. Liu Yawei was also involved in launching a new magazine called U.S.China Perception Monitor, which is a part of the new initiative of U.S.China relations by Carter Center. Dr. Liu is also our senior member of ICAS advisory board. We have 4 distinguished speakers today. Dr. Zhao Gang, he's the Deputy Director of Office for the Scheme of International Cooperation on Renewable Energy and New Energy Resources, China's Ministry of Science and Technology and National Development and Reform Commission. And Dr. Danish Simon, he's a Senior Advisor to the President for China Affairs and Professor of China Business and Technology at Duke University. He speaks fluent Chinese Mandarin. Dr. Anton Motkin, he's the assistant professor at the Chinese University of Hong Kong. He's also a frequent speaker at our China-U.S. Canada Trilateral Relations Roundtable series. And my colleague, Mr. Saurabh Gupta, he's a senior fellow of ICAS, and also he's taking the lead in our newly launched trade and technology program. Without further ado, I'm going to give the floor to Dr. Liu.
Thanks, Dr. Hong, for that introduction. Of our 4 speakers, I think I met 3 of them, Saurabh, Dennis, and Zhao Gang in person. I think I attended one of Anton's webinars online. And so I'm grateful that you are here to share your perspective on this very important issue to our audience, who are hailing from both China, U.S. and other parts of the world. Tomorrow is the Tokyo Olympic Games. I mentioned this because the increasing concern with China by the U.S. and other Western countries began in Beijing Olympic Games back in 2008. If we use this analogy, what is the Olympic moment of this current technological rivalry between the U.S. and China? It may be Huawei, it may be ZTE, it may be others. So today we're going to hear from 4 speakers, about that Olympic moment of this increasingly intense and very, fearful technological rivalry between the 2 countries. So today our format is our four speakers will make initial remarks between 7 to 10 minutes. After that, they will, and I will engage them with questions, and then we'll deal with questions from our audience. So our first speaker is Mr. Zhao Gang. He will share with us the China story. What exactly is the Chinese perspective on this thing? Is it, has changed in China, or is it what has changed in the U.S.? So without further ado, Zhao Gang, the floor is yours. You need to unmute yourself, please.
Okay, thank you, Yari. Thank you, everybody. 大家好，非常感谢亚宇的邀请，感谢红龙，我就用中文给大家介绍。我发言的题目呢是从电信产业看中美高科技产业的竞争与合作。
For our audience in U.S. and Canada and others, please look for translation of Zhao Gang's remarks in the chat box. Go ahead, Zhao Gang.
好，那我就用中文讲。OK， 谢谢。从电信产业看中美高科技产业的竞争与合作。从电信产业的发展历程来看，特别是在中国，我们体会特别深。大概从中国改革开放以后，从83年、84年那个时候，中国开始引进程控交换机，一直到2G、3G、4G、5G，现在在研究6G。从这电信产业的升级来看呢，中美之间有过非常多的合作，特别是技术的合作，设备的合作、产品的合作。但是呢，在这过程当中，随着中国企业竞争力的增强，特别是华为、中兴的崛起，美国它的竞争对手很多都衰落，所以呢，在这个过程当中产生了很多的摩擦和对立。我从
Let me just do a quick interpretation of what Zhao Gang just said. He basically talked about the rise of China's telecommunication industry represented by Huawei and ZTE. In the early years of China's telecommunication march, there's a lot of cooperation between US and China. However, more recently, because of the competitiveness of the Chinese telecommunication industry, there's growing concern by the US and other Western countries with China's telecommunication industry. Go ahead.
当时在中国的市场上，不仅仅有美国的朗讯、法国的阿尔卡特、德国的西门子、爱立信、日本的 NEC、富士通等等这样的一些电信的企业。同时呢，我们在一些大学，像北京邮电大学等等跟国外的大学呢也开展了很多的研发活动。应该说呢，这个阶段中国是处在学习的阶段，是完全是整套设备整套技术的成套技术的引进。
There's also collaboration between U.S. universities and Chinese universities in terms of telecommunication innovation. China has also imported wholesale of the equipment, telecommunication equipment from U.S. and other Western countries.
中国的市场上呢，基本上是处在销售、代理销售。中国的企业，包括像华为这样的企业，也是代理国外产品，同时呢进行售后服务、技术服务阶段，处在一个学习的阶段。这是第一阶段，学习的阶段。
The first stage of this development in China is, industries like Huawei and ZTE. They're really representatives of Western companies. They're learning how to walk the walk.
像当时最有名的几家电信的企业，像美国的朗讯、法国的阿尔卡特，还有美国的摩托罗拉。这3家企业呢，在中国也有大量的业务，而且在中国也设立了他自己的企业或者合资公司。 基本上垄断了中国市场的70%到80%。所以这段时间呢，应该说是中国和美国这高科技产业发展的一个蜜月期一个黄金的时期。
So the honeymoon between U.S. and China in the high-tech area is in this first stage. For example, Lucent Technologies, Motorola, and ICAS, these three companies basically have monopolized China's telecommunication market.
到了大概90年代，上个世纪90年代，到进入20世纪以后，这段时间呢，是中国企业的竞争力在崛起特别是以华为、中兴这样的企业开始发展，中国还有几个企业，像大唐电信等等这些呢，他们都初步的具备了一些技术的能力，但是呢，竞争力还不是很强。这个阶段呢，当然美国很有名的企业就是 Cisco 这个我们在中国的市场业务都非常强大，所以在这个时间呢，应该说中国的企业具备了初步的竞争能力美国的企业还垄断市场。这个阶段呢，大家相处就已经开始产生了一些摩擦已经有了一些竞争的元素。
So into the second stage, which began in the late 1990s and the first decade of the 21st century, China telecommunication industry is a fast learner, but U.S. company, particularly Cisco, still dominated the China market. But we see the early signs of competition between U.S. and China during the second stage.
2008年、2009年金融危机以后，世界市场，特别电信业的市场出现了一些新的发展，互联网的出现，信息技术的革命带来了一些新的企业的崛起，像特别是华为、三星，还有苹果这些企业崛起，智能化，所以在这个过程当中呢。像美国、欧洲很多的老牌的电信企业，像摩托罗拉等等这些都开始亏损巨亏甚至有的重组有的被兼并所以电信产业呢经历了一次大的动荡和洗牌像以华为三星为代表的这些企业呢，已经成为具非常强的竞争力的企业。
So the third stage began with really the financial tsunami in Wall Street in 2008. So at this third stage, the traditional telecommunication giant fell apart. A new group of technological giants began to emerge, such as Samsung, Apple, and Huawei in China. With that, there is increasing competition between the industries in China and the U.S.
像美国最辉煌的时候，他们的代表性的企业像朗讯还有阿尔卡特合并，像摩托罗拉已经重组，加拿大的北电网络也被重组，所以这些企业的经历能够看出来这个新的产业的格局形成，但是呢。这时候孕育着这种冲突和矛盾博弈特别是对美国市场特别是欧洲市场对华为、中兴已经开始有了一种敌视的眼光。
So in this stage, with the traditional tele giants falling apart, there emerged a new suspicion and increasing doubts of Chinese telecommunication industry represented by Huawei.
我们在参加这个中美创新对话2010年的时候，2011年，在美国的硅谷，当时我们组织了中方的企业家和学者跟美方的企业家和学者进行交流。在硅谷的时候呢，在 Cisco 的总部举行了一次的研讨会。当时我们也邀请了华为 美国的研究中心的负责人一起参加，这也是中美双方当时共同商定的。但是呢，华为负责人呢，华为美国研发中心的负责人，进入 CISC 总部以后，因为在会议室里为这个设备PPT 播放设备和 PPT 的问题，华为和 CISC 的员工就发生了冲突。后来呢，这个华为的人呢就离开了会场。从这件事情上可以看出来，这个竞争除了企业之间呢，还演变成了两个国家和美国和中国的这种科技的竞争和脱钩所以这个事情呢非常具有戏剧性。
So I want to share an anecdote with our audience about an encounter between Cisco and Huawei at one of the meetings called U.S. China Innovation Dialogue. So one of the seminars was held in the headquarters of Cisco. And we also invited the R&D chief from Huawei in the US. So at the conference room, the Huawei person got into not a physical fight, but into an argument with Cisco people in terms of what equipment to use so that he could broadcast his PPT. So that's an indication of industry competition, but which eventually become national and sovereign rivalry.
所以我这个总结起来，中美高科技产业的竞争与合作，应该说是经历了4个阶段第一个阶段就是双方是对中国来讲，我们是学习阶段也就是双方合作的起步阶段。从电信业可以看出整个中美高科技产业的合作就是在这个80年代到90年代中期的时候，那时候合作还是非常的顺利这个美国还有欧洲的这些国家也都非常愿意跟中国进行合作所以这个阶段呢，应该说主要是双方技术的差距比较大所以我觉得这是最重要的一个原因。
So let me just give you an overview of the staged development of this industry relationship. So the first stage is 1980s to the middle 1990s. And so at this stage, the gap between China and the US and other Western countries was huge. And China is basically is learning how to do it.
从90年代中期开始，一直到20年代初这段时间呢，应该说是初步竞争的阶段。合作当然还是主流也有了初步的竞争。在这个阶段呢，中国的技术呢差距的逐渐的缩小但是呢还没有那么很强的竞争力，特别是我们的企业竞争力还不是很强。所以这段时间呢，大家也能和平相处也能进行很多的合作。
So the second stage began in the mid-1990s to about 2005, 2008. At this stage, China's telecommunication industry is less competitive. So there's still a very close and intimate cooperation between the two countries.
从2011年开始一直到可能2016年这段时间应该说是竞争和合作的时代既竞争又合作。因为这段时间呢，中国的高科技企业的崛起对欧美这些原来的大的企业已经形成了很强的竞争能力已经瓜分了，已经分享了他们的市场所以在这个过程当中呢，这个竞争越来越激烈，甚至到了去参加会议双方不欢而散的这种地步但是呢也还是能够合作竞争和合作并存的阶段，这是第3阶段。
So the third stage is from 2010 to 2016. So this is still the stage of both competition and cooperation, but the pace of China's telecommunication industry's march has quickened a lot, and they started taking larger and larger market share in the U.S. and other parts of the world.
从2017年以后，到现在是中美科技脱钩的阶段。这个阶段呢，我们大家都很熟悉，主要是美国把中国定位为最大的战略竞争对手就非常遗憾。我觉得其实这段时间呢，我们既是竞争对手，同时仍然是合作伙伴，在很多方面我们还可以继续进行合作。像我们在一些基础科学，在一些重大的传染疾病在绿色技术等等这些领域呢，实际上还有很多的合作的机会。如果是完全脱钩呢，对双方非常不利。
So starting with 2016, 2017, we have entered the fourth stage, which is the stage of rivalry and decoupling. It's unfortunate that there are efforts at decoupling from both sides, but I think between U.S. and China, there are a lot of areas that the two countries can cooperate, such as green technology, pandemic, and other areas.
总结一下，中国的电信业为代表的高科技企业之所以发展的这么快，并不像我们美方有些人讲的那样，是侵犯知识产权，或者是偷窃技术等等，并不是这样，而是呢，中国采取了4个比较重要的政策。
I want to summarize what I have said. The rise of China's telecommunication industry is not the result of what is being described by many Americans and other Westerners, is that China is good at stealing intellectual properties. On the contrary, the success of China's telecommunication industry is because of the following 4 reasons.
第一个呢，就是中国改革开放，采取了市场经济，在这个很多的领域，充分的竞争，电信产业就是一个充分竞争的产业。充分竞争的产业，我们中国的企业和国外的企业一起在同一个规则下进行竞争，所以应该说是充分竞争的产业诞生了华为这样的中国的高科技企业。
So the first reason is China's open up and reform policy. China has adopted the market economy. Huawei is a perfect example of benefiting from fair rule-based competition.
第二个呢，是中国全社会高度重视科技创新，无论是从中国的中央政府，还是地方政府，还是我们的企业，都投入了非常多的研发经费。比如说我们中国的研发经费现在已经总量是世界第2了，已经占了20%左右，全世界的20%左右，仅次于美国。所以这个投入这是每年都在以20%左右的速度的增长，这个10年来以20%的速度的增长，所以这个投入也是很大，这个增长非常快。
The second reason is China's unprecedented emphasis on innovation. For example, if you look at the R&D budget in the past 10 years, every year there's a 20% increase. Now globally, China is ranked second after the United States in terms of the total investment in R&D. I think accounting for 20% of the global investment in R&D.
第三个呢，是中国巨大的市场，庞大的消费人群，带来了中国高科技产业的迅速发展。这个呢，无论是从我们的电信设备，还是从高铁，还是从我们的 IT，这都是非常的明显，是吧？互联网这巨大的消费市场和用户，这是拉动技术发展
The third reason is the hugeness of the China market. Whether we're talking about cell phones, whether we talk about internet consumers, e-commerce, you name it. In every sector, the China's market is so big, and there are so many Chinese consumers that has really propelled the progress of China's telecommunication industry.
第四个呢是国际合作，中国一直特别强调国际合作，因为我们改革开放需要跟发达国家，也需要跟这些发展中国家一起来合作。这一方面呢，中国既是受益者，也是贡献者。确实是我们不仅仅是学到了很多先进技术，我们也把很多的技術给其他的国家来分享。因为时间问题，我就不举例子。
The fourth reason is international cooperation. China not only cooperates with well-developed countries like U.S. and other Western countries, but also cooperate with developing countries in Africa, Latin America, and other parts of the world. Because of the time constraint, I won't provide the detailed examples of these cooperations.
对中美未来我提3个建议第一个呢，就是我们不能被政治来左右我们的科技合作。
So I have 3 recommendations in terms of having a more stable, fair technological high-tech relationship. The first one is there should be no politicization of innovation and high-tech development.
第二个呢，我们开拓这个更多的合作领域特别是像刚才说的，我们在竞争的方面呢，其实也可以合作。比如说是6G， 现在6G 正在兴起现在中国、美国、欧洲的这些国家也都在做6G。这6G 大家都是刚刚起步，在这一方面呢，现在也没有什么竞争的问题应该是有很多的合作空间。
The second is both countries need to develop a new area of cooperation. For example, in the 6G area, China, U.S. and other European countries have all started looking into that research. It's a perfect area for closer cooperation.
第3个呢，特别希望中美科学家、企业家多合作和交流这些我们的合作也好，我们未来发展也好，都是靠人都是靠我们这些科学家、工程师、企业家，还有靠我们的学者等等这些人多交流、多合作、多交朋友我们共同来克服一些困难共同来创造新的价值。
The third recommendation is to increase the people-to-people diplomacy between American and the Chinese entrepreneurs and researchers and scientists. These people are the bridges between the 2 countries. The real muscle of this interconnectedness. Without them, this slide into high-tech Cold War is unstoppable.
好的，我就讲到这儿，谢谢亚伟，谢谢各位。
All right, thanks, Zhao Gang. So now we're going to move on to Dennis to share with us the American story, the changing landscapes of U.S. attitude and policies toward China's high-tech industry.
Well, thank you.
Dennis, you're muted.
Okay, can you hear me now?
No, we can't hear you.
Okay, so thank you to the Carter Center and the Institute for China-American Studies for inviting me to the webinar to speak. I'm going to take 40+ years of U.S.-China technology and education cooperation and compress it into 10 minutes with some comments. And just to give you a warning, I'm going to close with a somewhat contrarian view in terms of what the political environment is like in Washington and make some suggestions that we redirect our efforts. If we look back, we can see that the original cooperation agreements in science and technology and education were consummated sometime around 1978, 1979, just as China was opening to the outside world. And when we look at these early exchanges, we can see that they were largely limited to small numbers of graduate students and a few scholars coming back and forth between the two countries. Most of the students we know were, as I said, graduate students. And aside from really China's capabilities with respect to nuclear weapons, no one was really concerned about an economic or technological threat or competition from China. And at the time, visitors who had gone to China, China was just very much an afterthought, other than perhaps the dream of the market of 1 billion consumers. Other than that, most people did not pay much attention to where China was headed, other than that China was having a stable and progressive kind of economic development. Even as Chinese leaders very clearly and very explicitly laid out their intention to close the technological gap with the West and eventually even catch up, the prospect of some kind of serious challenge from China was something that seemed very unlikely, even at a minimum. The initial cooperation, as we know, between the two countries was largely government-driven, and it was basically based on an overarching umbrella agreement and a series of sub-agreements that were signed between Beijing and Washington. Each of these agreements involved almost every cabinet level department in the U.S. government, and eventually we reached some 30 to 40 areas of bilateral cooperation between the two countries. But today the situation has changed remarkably, with non-governmental exchanges and cooperative initiatives far, far outseeding the number of government projects. Every major prominent university today has multiple cooperation agreements with counterpart organizations in China. And as we know, there are over 370,000 Chinese students, mostly this time self-paying undergraduates, and literally thousands of scholarly exchanges going on between think tanks, universities, and other organizations. Tsinghua University actually became the first Chinese university to set up a joint venture campus, this time in Seattle, working with the University of Washington and Microsoft. There are several U.S. affiliated joint ventures in China, including where I was from, Kunshan, as well as NYU Shanghai. Many American multinationals today have not only investments in China, but they also have R&D centers that they've set up, despite all of the complaints about IPR violation. All in all, I think it's safe to say few could have imagined at the time that the scale and scope of what has occurred would reach the current levels. And it is almost a surprise that it seems some people woke up and said, wow, when did this all happen? So I think we are at a very interesting inflection point. And I would argue that the playing field between the two countries has really been altered in dramatic fashion. And a new level of complexity has entered into these relationships, which were once very simple, basic cooperation agreements, aside from a few problems of access and data ownership, et cetera. And these concerns and this complexity really has fostered a major focus now on issues linked to U.S. national security, Chinese illegal acquisition of technology, theft of intellectual property, cyber hacking, the recent case that we see with Microsoft, the entire integrity of the U.S. research enterprise and the Chinese role in it, and several other problems that have really cast a cloud over the relationship in these two areas, which once were considered to be so-called safe areas, where the level of mutual trust and understanding between the two countries had been leveraged often, particularly in times of political difficulty. So in other words, we have reached a point of great discontinuity in the relationship. And the penultimate expression of this was the U.S. Innovation and Competition Act that was recently passed this summer by the U.S. Congress. The act itself, as we know, has many dimensions and in fact, many positive elements in terms of helping to advance U.S. innovation performance. but it's also filled with a number of very explicit anti-China provisions that reflect this growing fear about a so-called rising threat from China. So let me cite just a few of the disruptive changes that have occurred and give you reason to think that perhaps it is time to reconfigure and restructure the cooperative bilateral relationship, and the same agreements that have been in effect for 40 years, maybe it's time now to redesign those and put in place a whole new set of agreements so that they can carry us for the next 40 years. So Zhao Gang hit the nail on the head when he spoke about Chinese R&D spending. China has gone from being considered an innovation laggard to now an innovation leader. We've moved from the idea, for example, a couple of recent articles a few years ago in Harvard Business Review about why China can't innovate, to today, the accepted notion that China is about to eat our lunch here in the United States. China was ranked 14th in terms of the global innovation dialogue, both in 2019 and 2020, which means it was #1 among middle-income countries in terms of its innovation performance. This all suggests that while China has not yet reached the level of the United States and most of Western Europe, it is growing rather quickly and it has a lot of unrealized potential. The second is the shift from what was a highly asymmetrical, very hierarchical relationship between the US and China in technology to one of greater parity in terms of both capability and capacity. Not only has Chinese R&D spending grown, but the country now has a very sizable high-end talent pool. Chinese universities have been dramatically improved, and the R&D infrastructure, which was once obsolete and woefully behind, has now been dramatically modernized. Whether we measure this progress in terms of patent generation or authorship of articles in top-tier scientific journals, China now is a generator of intellectual capital rather than simply a recipient. The third shift is a shift in terms of China from basically in a catch-up mode to China now in a competing mode. And again, I think Zhao Gang outlined this very well in terms of telecom. China is no longer a passive or reactive player. It is becoming part of the agenda-setting, rule-making processes in international science and technology affairs. And to use Professor Mike Lampton's terminology, China is no longer simply a rule taker or even a rule breaker. It is now a rule maker, and China aspires to become even a more active rule maker. This also is a big point of change. Fourth is the transition from China simply being a learner and an information taker to becoming a source of technology and a shaper in terms of things like international technical standards. We also see that China's engagement with the Belt and Road countries, 65 plus different countries, is now focused increasingly on science and technology and education cooperation as much as it is on infrastructure development. The Chinese Academy of Sciences is playing a key role in training the future scientists and engineers that will work across all of these Belt and Road countries. And finally, fifth, but not least important, China has made the transition from a country with a serious brain drain problem to a country that is now experiencing a reverse brain drain or a brain gain situation. China is now attracting back a lot of high-end talent simply because it is a hothouse economy. And it's a hothouse economy where digitalization and the Internet of Things are taking hold much faster than in the West, and then more faster than most people realize. Now, clearly, not all the best and the brightest are going back to China, but people like Shuri Gong, who's the new president of Westlake University, and others like him have decided to come back to China to lead China's technological advance. And with them, they bring the latest, newest ideas, not only about knowledge, but also about how to organize research and how to create very productive R&D teams. So China is recruiting not only these overseas Chinese to come back, but it's also recruiting talent from all around the world, and it's finding itself with increasing success. The bottom line basically is very simple. The arrangement that was put in place when this cooperation began has changed in fundamental ways over the last 40 years. And it's time that we think about redesigning a new framework for cooperation that takes place of 4 decades of learning about what works and what doesn't work, as well as a variety of the problems that I mentioned that we've discovered along the way. Clearly, there are problems, serious problems that require our attention, but it is in our joint interest to arrest these problems before the current downward spiral acquires even greater momentum and it becomes impossible to turn back. That said, I would argue that we need new rules of the road for moving us forward. Despite the bellicose, confrontational anti-China noise we hear in Washington and the new rhetoric about self-reliance coming out of Beijing, the fundamental reality is that decoupling and disengagement are boneheaded ideas. The simple fact is that there is no science and technology related global problem, clean energy, climate change, global health, water, etc., whose meaningful solution does not depend on a close U.S.-China relationship in science, technology, and education. By building a new framework that reflects new realities surrounding this bilateral relationship, perhaps we can rebuild some of the trust that's been lost, and we can harness the multiplicity of actual and potential synergies that exist between the two countries. For the first time, I would argue, China's developing S&T capabilities can give real meaning to the idea of mutual benefit. It would be total folly for the United States to walk away just when China's scientific community and educational institutions can put considerable knowledge and expertise on the table, knowledge that could be of real substantive value for the United States and also for the rest of the world in terms of solving some of the most pressing problems facing this generation and for generations to come. And I'll stop here. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Dennis, for that. So I'm sure our audience and our panelists are curious about your new framework. But before we're going to ask you questions on that, we're going to move on to Anton Malkin, who will provide a very unique perspective, in this kind of divisive U.S.-China S&T competition, where the middling economies are going to be. So Anton, right away with it.
Okay, sure. And I have some really quick slides for us, just to accompany for visuals, just to accompany my presentation. So I'm going to do, can everybody see, by the way?
Yes.
My slide? Okay, that's perfect. So the point that I really want to emphasize is that Canada is often the choice that Canada is often presented with, if we look at commentary in the media and if we look at what the common sort of framework is about Canada's thinking about U.S.-China decoupling S&T, science and technology competition, is Canada will be forced to choose. Either go with Chinese technology or American technology. And because of our geographic location, because of our military and other defense collaboration, intelligence collaboration with the United States, we don't really have a choice. We're going to have to go with American technology. So I'm here to sort of burst that bubble a little bit and explain why that's actually the reality is far more complicated than that, why the binary choice really is not as clear and simple as it seems. So when we're talking about science and technology, what exactly is Canada's dilemma? So Canada's dilemma is that when we look at the intensity of research and development of R&D compared to our peers and at the OECD, we haven't been doing that well. And so when we think about, keep this, just keep this visual in mind as I go through the rest of my introduction. When we think of, choosing sides or decoupling from China ourselves, what is that going to achieve with respect to, our own lagging S&T, achievements over the past, past few years. And think about the situation that Canada finds itself in, where we have actually really great universities, where we have really great potential and really great basic research that, as we can, really great basic research that global companies and researchers from all over the world, including China and the United States, are very interested in. But Canada's problem fundamentally is that we don't really, we're not very good at realizing the value of that research. So if you look at, for example, the top 10, and this is from, this is Canadian patent data from our patent office, the top 10 patent applications in Canada for fiscal year 2019 to 2020, what do you see? Number one, it's a cell phone company called Oppo. A lot of Canadians probably have no idea who that is. It is a Chinese, it's a top global phone, manufacturer. They sell a lot of phones in China and in other countries. Canada, we probably haven't heard of them. Obviously, then you have familiar names. You have Qualcomm, you have Boeing, American companies, not Chinese, of course. You have Pratt & Whitney, but look at this, Huawei. They're right there. Alibaba, they're right there. So they realize, American and Chinese companies realize the potential of Canada. Canadian companies, maybe not so much. And so just something like Canada, when we're talking about, China-U.S. here, I think there's some things that Canadians get wrong about Chinese S&T potential and Chinese companies that commercialize this, potential. So China is currently a net importer of S&T assets, right? They import a lot of foreign technology because they're not ahead in every field. And Canadians should really think about what happens when they become net exporters, because we, as Professor Simon just mentioned to us, we didn't expect that a long time ago. But what if it happens? See, we got a taste of that with the U.S., with what's happening with Huawei, where the United States is forcing countries to choose, forcing countries to, abandon using Huawei technology. If Huawei's technology wasn't advanced, this would really not be a problem, but it is. Canadians should think about what happens when something like Internet of Things, in manufacturing, in retail, when electric and autonomous vehicles, what if these technologies are led by Chinese companies? Well, so take a look at those patent applications on the right. That future is probably not that far off. So in that context, we also underestimate China's R&D potential itself. Its intellectual property system is strong and getting stronger, despite the common perception. It's also one of the most important litigation jurisdictions for standard essential patents. That a lot of Canadians might not know what that is, but this is why, we're thinking of, okay, well, let's not do business with these companies and everything will be okay. Well, it doesn't work that way. Chinese companies contribute to setting global standards, along with American and European and Japanese and Korean companies. Canadian companies used to do that, not so much anymore. So when Chinese companies contribute to these standards, we still have to do business with them. They are global standards. And a previous American administration did try to prevent its scientists from going to standard setting bodies with Huawei, and that didn't work, because that means then that American companies cannot set global standards. So think about what decoupling means. It's not just about, I won't buy an Oppo phone, or I won't buy a Huawei phone or a Xiaomi phone. That's not all it is. And so, in terms of Canadian technology, we have to think of China as a key market for green technology, hydrogen fuel cells. There's companies in Ontario doing that. Chinese electric vehicle makers are actually quite advanced. They are emerging investors in Canada. And so just some points to take away. And so Canada's problem is we don't realize the value of our S&T assets. If we stop doing business with China or doing university research collaboration with China, is that going to change? It is I think it is very foreseeable that Canada will be left behind by the competition, because it has neither a large domestic market, so it's not China or the United States. We don't have the same market. We're also, Canada thrives on openness. We can't afford self-sufficiency Arguably, nobody can, but to the same extent that China and the United States can, we cannot. And I'm speaking as a Canadian, from a Canadian perspective. It is well positioned, because nor is it, we don't have large competitive ICC firms. We're not well positioned at the moment, if our policies don't change, to extract value from the next wave of science and technology commercialization in areas like electric and autonomous vehicles and Internet of Things. We're just not, unless, and we, the problem is we did used to have companies that led the world of technology. We had companies like Nortel. But you think about the problem that they faced and the mistakes they made and the dilemma facing us today. See, one of the problems at Nortel was that they really thought of the world in terms of North America. So we have to get into the American market. We have to stay firmly there. And they, to an extent, neglected global standard setting. They neglected the global market. And in the end, we don't have any more Nortel, right? For various reasons, but this was one of the dilemmas, and it continues to be an issue for a lot of Canadian companies that do R&D and try to commercialize basic research, because we're very good at basic research, not so great at commercialization. And there is really no such thing, as I mentioned earlier, as exclusively American or Chinese technology. What matters is how basic fundamental R&D is commercialized and who gets the share of the revenues, right? And so we also have to think about the risks created by extraterritorial national security enforcement. Areas like science and technology, the U.S. is not necessarily a replacement for replacement partner, replacement market for China. Preventing collaboration with Chinese researchers could simply mean that American firms will get a greater payoff from Canadian R&D without the corresponding benefit to Canada. Working with the assumption that technology flows to China and not from China, I think will mean that Canada may simply get cut off from science and technology output coming out of China. Okay, so I think rather than having specific policy recommendations, I really think that policymakers and the public in Canada should think about these 3-4 questions that I have here. Do we really face a choice between two technological ecosystems? Just think about the extent to which that's actually true. What problems does S&C, science and technology, decoupling, address for Canada? What problems does it create? What are Canada's primary challenges in the context of science and technology and innovation? And that's, I think, what Canadians should focus on. Thank you.
Thanks, Anton. I think you highlighted a very important area. I hope researchers in other countries are also going to look at the issues that you have been looking at. So our cleanup hitter is Saurabh Gupta. He's going to talk about the connection and disconnection, or continuity or discontinuity of the Trump administration's policy versus President Biden's policy, and the overall trajectory of this U.S.-China high-tech rivalry. Saurabh? No, you're muted. Still muted.
Yeah.
All right.
That's great. Great. Good to see you, Dr. Liu, first of all, and thank you for chairing our webinar. And I think it's just, Dr. Simon gave a perfect table setter for what I am going to say, because he set the table in terms of what's happening for 40 years, and we are at an inflection moment, and I'm going to be talking a little about that inflection moment, specifically with regard to what is continuity and what is the discontinuity between the Trump and Biden policies in the area of technology vis-a-vis China. The first, I have just 3 key takeaways, but before I get to my first takeaway, I'll just emphasize that it's still early going and it's still a work in progress in the Biden administration. For example, during one of the large, big, dramatic decisions that the Trump administration had made in the area of information technology, they had put out, once the U.S.-China trade talks had kind of failed in what was it, in May 2019, they came out with this ICT executive order, which essentially gave a huge amount of discretionary power to the Commerce Department to frame ICT standards, and a great amount of interventionist capability to kick people out of the market and to basically frame the design of the market. And this got a lot of pushback from business. But nevertheless, in the dying days of the Trump administration, this final rule was jammed through. And essentially at this point of time, the Commerce Secretary has tremendous power in terms of defining how the ICT market in the US, who are the players, who are not the players, and what the framework looks like. This also provides an insight of how the Biden administration has gone forward on this, because it is obviously uncomfortable with this order, and business is very, very uncomfortable given the wide discretionary scope. But the Biden team did not revoke the order. What they have done is actually allow that order to play itself out. It is live, it is living. There has been no knee-jerk revocation of the order or of other orders, I would say executive orders that the Trump administration put out in this area. What the Biden team has done is being a lot more deliberative in terms of where it's going to go next. And in this regard, once it comes to a decision on what needs to change and what doesn't need to change, it is then very proactive. For example, within this last month, we've seen that order with regard to TikTok come off. We've seen the Biden administration wholesale rescind an executive order by Trump on data security. And it has said that we are going to go and reframe these standards by ourselves. And in areas where they have not come to those decisions, they've said, okay, let the Trump administration, we will go with the flow of what the Trump team did. And when we come to our decisions, we will make that known. And that's why I say early in the day to make a decision. And even though we've had some supply chain reports, I think the main emphasis on with regard to things like emerging and foundational technologies, et cetera, where the Biden team will come down, it's not in any hurry to make those decisions. But anyway, so all I want to get at is it's a work in progress still, and it's early in the day. My first big key takeaway is, and this follows from what I just said, is that there is a great degree of, a good deal of continuity, frankly, with the Trump administration on technology policy. And we need to understand how dramatic this is. And this is the main point I want to get across. Even into the Trump administration, say as late as 2018, one could make the case that the US was coming down hard on China because it believed that the Chinese, that there was no level playing field in the advanced manufacturing and high technology sector between in China, that there was a tilted field in terms of China providing its advantages through concessionary finance or through its state-owned enterprises working on non-market terms, and that this was a real competitive challenge to not just American producers, but to the global system per se, and the integrity of international rules in technology competition. And that the pressure that the US was bringing to bear was to ensure that Chinese industrial policy moved on much more pro-competitive and pro-market lines. One could make this case that the pressure the US, the EU were bringing was for this reason. But today, standing here now, one can say very clearly, frankly, and unfortunately, and this is a continuity from Trump to Biden, that the emphasis on the American side perhaps no longer is creating that level playing field necessarily and creating a pro-market, pro-competitive standards and disciplines by which everybody competes, as much as in key high technology sectors, it has become unrestricted zero-sum competition, zero-sum warfare, in terms that market itself can be squelched, can be squeezed, can be held down by Western governments, because it feels that in these sectors, it is, of course, the competition is a good thing, but American and Western technological supremacy cannot be lost. And we see that in 5G. We see that and of course, in many of the actions with regard to Huawei. And we see that fundamentally in semiconductors, which is essentially the lifeblood of information technology. And it's still very early going in terms of where this goes, say 10 years down the line. It's hard to say about that, whether private markets are going to be completely skewed in these sectors and that there's going to be a decoupling altogether, simply because in this case of unrestricted technology warfare competition, it is not acceptable to have China holding the commanding heights. I say this is early going simply because, you know, this is 5G and this is semiconductors, yes, but, you know, as we've heard in the previous presentations, we'll have EVs and we'll have in green technologies. I mean, we have not reached the zenith in terms of technology competition. We are in fact at the starting point in some ways in the advanced technology sector. And therefore, I mean, we cannot have these unrestricted warfare, frankly, happening, zero-sum warfare. We need certain rules of the road, and we need those rules of the road to be framed by the major players and the major markets, which also includes China. And that is not on the horizon right now, and we'll have to see how we get there. But the fact of the matter is that the normal that we had in U.S.-China science and technology relations as late as pre-Trump or even 2018 no longer exists in the post-Trump world, and that there's this element of continuity in what in the Biden administration in this regard vis-a-vis China. And I think this is the biggest takeaway, if I have any one takeaway to give today in this presentation. Smaller takeaways in this regard of continuity, there's a wide range of discretionary enforcement tools which are being used. People are aware of it. Entities list, the SDT, specially designated nationals, and we have work release orders placed by this agency, by that agency. It's a broad toolkit which has been used and which will continue to be used. So nothing new in that regard. It's just more continuity. And therefore, I mean, at this point, you're thinking like, yes, there is going to be this decoupling. Second takeaway is, and in this regard, there's a small change from the Trump administration, is that the Biden administration has been a lot more nuanced and focused in the application of its controls and sanctions. We've seen that most notably, perhaps in the section, you know, in the supply chain reports. The Trump administration came with these huge Section 232 actions against steel and auto producers and all. And when Biden did this very thorough supply chain review, including of semiconductors, all they could think about is doing a Section 232 in one small, tiny industrial subsector area. It has a lot of other recommendations also, but the idea is to do this in a much more nuanced way rather than in the sledgehammer way that the Trump administration came against China. And there's a secondary difference with regard to Biden, is that Biden really realizes that America needs to get its house in order to compete vis-a-vis China, and that it's not just about pulling China down. America needs to compete. The Trump administration spent a little too much time on its protectionist trade policies to be making those investments in American capabilities at home to compete. And I think the Biden team is going down that route, particularly through, you see, in its infrastructure bills, et cetera, et cetera. Final takeaway, to keep it brief, I would say my final takeaway, a little bit of a misconception that we have that Trump was America first and Biden is with allies first. That is true in the trade area where Trump was very protectionist and there was America first at the expense of the rest of the world. But in the technology area, come 2019 onwards, the Trump team was also as much as let's bring allies together and let's try to then kind of exclude China from these supply chains. and that, which is kind of continuity with what Biden is doing. The difference out here is that Trump, as I said, came with a sledgehammer approach, and that really caused fear among allies that, you know, we can't sign up to just an overarching blank MOU calling for decoupling. We need to be a lot more nuanced in this because we have great interest in the Chinese market. So you come to us with greater clarity of the areas where you feel, America, that we need to have these controls or have a higher kind of walls, and we will see if that meets our interest, and we will agree to those. And that's why you had people like the Japanese themselves who said, we're not going to participate in the clean network that the Trump administration put out, because clean network was clean across many, many dimensions of advanced technology cooperation. But the Japanese are on board in principle in having these nuanced controls because they understand the value of having this and having and the security implications of it. And I will just close by saying that at this time, though it's still early in the day to call whether we are going to have a decoupled world or not. And frankly, as Dr. Simon said, I mean, this is, almost crazy. It just doesn't happen. There's so much innovation and creativity happening in China, and there's such a huge market that you can't just, this is not the Soviet Union of old, and you can just have two decoupled worlds in that regard. And where the allies come down out here will become very important, because business in the US and in Japan and South Korea is apprehensive about this about what the politicians want to do. But when I say politicians, it's primarily Western and US politicians who want to have this sort of high walls between US and China. A lot of politicians in Japan and South Korea and in East Asia have their own apprehensions too, in terms of how expansive, what are we doing on these commercial dimensions by bringing in these national security elements into it. And so at this point of time, how it plays out with allies in which sectors is still a matter of conjecture, though I would say in things like 5G and in semiconductors, I think many of the allies are going to be on board, and this will make it difficult for China to get its own act going, because particularly in semiconductors, there is a vast gap in the value chain. But my key takeaway out here is that this is now different from what Trump was doing. Trump was also trying to bring allies on board in terms of technology controls and a degree of decoupling. Because Mr. Biden is doing it in just a much more nuanced way, the chances are that he will actually get more buy-in from his allies, but we'll have to see where this stands. And so at this point, there are more questions than answers, but that's where I see the Biden administration in its first few months in office. And we just have to hope that this new normal, again, becomes a little bit of the old normal, in which we have good open technology competition on fair level playing field, rather than having unrestricted warfare and trying to create separation, which will hurt all parties, and frankly it will lead to unfortunate outcomes, I would say. Thank you.
Thanks, Saurabh. I'm aware that our webinar is going to be over in about 15 minutes. So what I'm going to do is, I think Dennis, Zhao Gang, and Anton, please look at the Q&A. And I think each of you should just pick one question to answer. While you are looking at that, I'm going to ask Saurabh one question. That is, if, for example, if Zhao Gang's boss is going to call you and say, what are we going to do, when U.S. and the Western countries are trying so hard to decouple. So if you're going to give the Chinese leaders or decision makers some recommendation in terms of how to respond to this kind of pressure, what would be your three top recommendations to the China side?
Let me give two top recommendations. The first recommendation would be that the path that China was being pushed onto, and it was also beginning to make those reforms, China must continue going down that path. And that path is to reform and restructure its industrial policies to have them more pro-market, pro-competitive, and according to best international practices and standards. The days of skewing markets through dominant enterprises, I think that day is over. Because China needs to become have higher productivity growth, it also needs to reform its industrial structure, and including reform of the state-owned enterprises. This was a reform that had already begun. The Europeans are pressing very hard on this front. China has shown willingness to do this, both in the phase 2, in the negotiations with the US and in the comprehensive agreement on investment. China needs to proceed on this front, because China needs to show to the world, which it has not been able to show, that there is no tilted playing field at home. Once it can convince the world that that is the case, then China could, in those areas of the market where the Americans or the Westerners do not allow the market to function, in those areas, then China can take its own state-initiated measures in terms of whether it wants to skew the competition or tilt the playing field a little bit. But first, China needs to get its market on a pro-competitive basis, globally pro-competitive basis, so that it can have the credibility to say, our markets are open, free, fair, and competitive. In these particular sectors, you did not allow competition. So where you don't allow the market to work, you should not expect that our markets are also going to work for you. That's point one. The point two, I would say, is, and this is probably China's strongest asset, is the extent of innovation and entrepreneurialism in China and the size of its market. Think of semiconductors. Yes, I said it's the lifeblood of the information technology, but it's also kind of like an upstream resource like oil. It's great to have oil, but if you don't have any applications to put that oil to use to, that oil will just stay in the ground. What gives semiconductors value is the incredible creativity that's happening in the technology sector in China and elsewhere in the world. And if China can lead on innovation, there is other countries willy-nilly will have to have a China strategy, including perhaps a China manufacturing strategy for advanced technologies. And I think at that point of time, the question of a decoupling simply will not arise. So China must continue to innovate, continue to stimulate entrepreneurialism, including basic science and technology, and keep its markets open, because it is too attractive a proposition for Western companies and countries thereafter to cede that market. And I would say those are the two most important things China needs to do.
Thanks. That was a very good and comprehensive answer. So we're going to go to Zhao Gang. I think there's one question for Zhao Gang. That is, when U.S. is trying so hard to decouple, can China move closer to European countries? Zhao Gang. Turn on your microphone. 你的麦克风没打开。
谢谢杨伟。我还是用中文回答，还请麻烦你帮我翻译一下。
OK。
中美科技脱钩，现在呢，我个人的想法就是一个呢，我们不脱钩，我们中美还是要合作，科技还是要合作，因为我们还是有很多的相互之间的需求，完全脱钩现在也不可能，所以一个呢，我们还是要发展和美国的科技的关系合作，同时我们跟其他国家，包括欧盟、欧洲在内，我们实际上呢，过去有很多的合作，科技方面有很多的合作，历史也很长，合作的领域也很多，应该是我们还有继续扩大合作的空间。
So my answer to the question from the audience is number one, China does not want to decouple. Number two, it's impossible for US and China to decouple totally in the technological field. China has a long history of cooperating in the field of technology with European countries, and China will continue to expand that cooperation.
在这个合作当中，在未来的合作当中，因为比如说像跟欧洲跟其他的地方的合作，我们这个刚才说的电信产业实际上也有很多的合作，包括我们在5G 的时候就有很多的欧洲的这种组织大学企业来跟中国来合作。现在在6G 上我们也有一些的合作，所以这个合作呢，应该说是还是很有吸引力。
So China's cooperation in the telecommunication industry is going very strong, including in the area of 6G. European companies, European universities are also very much in the cooperation mode with their counterparts in China.
特别是在现在碳达峰、碳中和、气候变化、绿色科技这一方面呢，欧洲实际上的标准还是很高，他们的这种要求也很高，所以在这方面呢，应该说是我们跟欧洲的合作这个互补性也非常强，在这方面应该还是有很大的空间。
In the area of climate change, the European standards are very, very high, and China and the U.S. can enter into a supplementary and complementary cooperation.
好了，我就回答到这。
All right, now we're going to go to Anton, and Dennis, you'll be the cleanup hitter in our Q&A session. So Anton, I don't think you need to answer that question regarding Meng Wanzhou, but there's one other good question, unless you want to say something about Meng Wanzhou.
No, I don't think so. But I'm going to answer a couple of questions that I think there's a couple of questions raised, and I'm going to combine them because I think they're talking about the same thing. And this is the United States and other countries, Canada, joining into this kind of coalition, science and technology coalition to counter China's rise. Okay, well, I just have a kind of sort of an experience, something, when I talk to people in the technology industry here in Shenzhen, this is the story that I get, and I think I'll tell this story as a sort of an answer to this question. So again, I'm not going to answer it very directly because it gets into these kind of national security issues, which I'm not an expert in. But I will tell this story because I want to illustrate the problem with framing it as such. Okay, so why, I ask, why didn't companies like, Huawei and DJI, et cetera, they're now forbidden from buying American semiconductor components, chips 7 nanometers and smaller. Why didn't you guys try to develop, a Chinese, made in China sort of a manufacturing capacity that compete with TSMC and Samsung? Couldn't you foresee something like this happening? And the answer was, the answer typically is, why before, when we trusted American companies, why would we do that? It's expensive. We can invest somewhere else. Yes, we are dependent on American technology at this very important high level, but they are reliable partners. Why would we do that? It doesn't make sense from a business perspective. So the Chinese government spent many years supporting the domestic semiconductor manufacturing industry, and a lot of technology companies, they just wouldn't use these domestic companies because you can have TSMC, and then you can use TSMC to fabricate your semiconductor components, just like American companies that decided no longer to fabricate and outsource to TSMC and to Samsung and to others. We're part of a global system. We are part of a global, network, and it doesn't make business sense. Now I ask them, does it make business sense? Now, absolutely it makes business sense. Now you see more venture capital going into semiconductor manufacturing is a long process, right? But semiconductor design, now you have BYD, Geely, car manufacturers having their own, because electric autonomous vehicles are basically computers on wheels. They have their own chips now. Why? Because, before you could count on others, now you have to, you have to think about what if Americans sanction us? And when you think about American allies, what do you see? Do you see, oh, here's a good opportunity to join? Well, maybe if you're South Korea, or if you're, a European company, you might be seeing an opportunity to de-Americanize your own supply chain, to say, hey, we're trustworthy. We're good business partners. You don't have to worry about us. So if you want to compete globally, you're not, we like to think of this in terms of these grand global coalitions, but these are people, and they are businesses, and they are scientists making their own decisions. And these are scientists that might have been willing to study in the United States and Europe, and now they have more opportunities in China. These are companies that might have thought, I will never compete with these American companies. Now they're seeing an opportunity. And this is, by the way, this is not just me, this is something the American Semiconductor Industry Association warned about. So again, you can have, I'm not a security expert, the Science and Technology Coalition to counter China, I don't know. But it's, again, it doesn't always work the way you want it to work.
Thanks, Anton. So now we're going to Dennis. Dennis, whichever question you would like to address, I will ask what I asked Saurabh. That is, if you're called by, just say, Secretary of Commerce, because Saurabh said commerce has so many jurisdictions in terms of regulating this market. If the question is, does our strategy work to decouple with China? If it doesn't work, what would you like to propose? Go ahead, Dennis.
Okay, so there were a bunch of questions, but let me answer that one first, and then if we have time, I'll respond to one or two other quickly. I think the sad reality is that the reason why we don't see a differentiation between the Trump and the Biden approaches right now is that the Biden administration at least claims that it is putting in place an overall comprehensive integrated China strategy. And therefore, it is not going to make a decision ad hoc in any sub areas until, in effect, the whole strategic framework for that new strategy is laid out. It wants to avoid inconsistencies. So if it makes a commitment today, and then that strategy, goes in a slightly different direction, it doesn't want to be stuck to continue forward with a policy that doesn't fit the overall framework. It's unfortunate that it's so slow to evolve. I just read yesterday that there are some 60 State Department and other related positions that have yet to be confirmed because Senator Cruz is holding them up. So Biden is, has most of his team there, but not all of the team. And I think that they have been unable to coalesce quickly around what this new China strategy should be. So I think that's what we're seeing. We're seeing, look, if in doubt, it's better to control than not to control. You take the conservative approach rather than open things up. I think most of us anticipated that there was going to be a change in policy with Biden towards China, perhaps somewhat more relaxed, not any less demanding in terms of reforms and changes, but somewhat more relaxed and less contentious and less conflictual. But we've seen this continuity has been repeated. I think we're going to see that for another, several months until this new integrated strategy is worked out. And that may be the right thing to do at the end of the day, is not to solve problems ad hoc one by one, but is to think of them in terms of an overall framework. And I think that what that overall framework does give, and I think the visit of Wendy Sherman to China this week, the hope is that it's going to provide sources of leverage and opportunities for trade-offs and areas for complementarities, so that we can work policy, just like, for example, Biden did with Germany about the gas pipeline. He did something with the gas pipeline in order to get and rebuild the German relationship with the United States. I think that we are now in for this kind of situation where the framework is going to be decided, and then we're going to go jump in and try to work through each of these problems with that framework as the backdrop. There were two questions, I think, one about the U.S. policy towards China with respect to our own competitiveness, and another one about the arrest of Chinese, or at least the attempted arrest of some Chinese American scientists. And I think that the common word here is immigration policy. I think one of the hallmarks of what we have to do vis-a-vis the whole world, but in particular towards China, is understand what our immigration policy ought to be. I think it's a very dangerous proposition to go out and through innuendo and pointing fingers and other things, just cast some doubt about the loyalty and the integrity of many Chinese American scientists, and in fact become a cause for many of them to consider returning back home to China because they fear for their own careers and things that they've done. In the most cases, what we've seen in terms of the public domain, what's been reported out about these FBI cases, that we have yet really found the smoking gun in any of those cases. Yes, there's been some visa fraud, and yes, there have been some people who got paid some extra money that they didn't report to their dean, and a couple of things like that. And not that those aren't problems, they are problems. But there hasn't been this big espionage or theft of technology that seems to have been suggested when the Vice President Pence said, this is a whole of society effort, and the head of the FBI, reiterated this is a whole of society, as if, everybody, overseas Chinese as well as Chinese back home, are engaged in a grand global conspiracy, to kick the United States in the butt. I think at the end of the day, what the Innovation and Competition Act does is it tries to provide some new momentum in order to drive better performance out of the U.S. R&D system, and this is badly needed. My criticism of it is that it shouldn't simply be an anti-China effort. It should be an effort that stands on its own bona fides, that the United States should be able to work with other countries. And I just would commend to you two articles that just recently appeared over the last 2 weeks. One by Bruce Geil and Carolyn Wagner in Issues in Science and Technology, and another one by Wendy Wolford of Cornell University, all dealing with the globalization of innovation and the need for collaboration in R&D. I think that we have entered a world in which the Lone Ranger is dead. The idea that any country is going to have the keys to the kingdom and be able to control technology from somebody else is just simply an obsolete concept. All new knowledge discovery, all new knowledge creation depends on cross-border, cross-cultural, cross-functional collaboration. And if we don't understand that, and that fundamental point, and know how to manage that, leverage that, and get the best out of it, our country will fall at the short end of the straw, because we're not going to be able to keep pace in a world that everyone else is marching forward in terms of a global perspective, and we are kind of looking backwards rather than ahead into the future. So that's my biggest worry.
Thanks. I'm now going to turn to Dr. Hong to conclude. I think we're only 3 minutes over our scheduled time, and we're doing pretty good. So Dr. Hong, the floor is yours.
Well, a double thank you to Dr. Liu for being such a great moderator and also being such an excellent interpreter. Let me join Dr. Liu by thanking all our 4 excellent speakers for a very insightful discussion. I surely learned a lot, and a very quick takeaway. I think different countries have different priorities or interests or demands, but everyone is increasingly aware of the fact that the new problems and new challenges that we heard today, followed by new technology, need to be faced together. Back to the US and China, I think they must find a way to foster cooperation and also mutually beneficial collaboration. And this will be only achievable by increased transparency and also active efforts to combat technological protectionisms. Thanks to our online participants for staying with us for today's discussion. We will produce a summary of Dr. Zhao's opening remark to include when we post a video on our website. And due to the time limit, and I'm aware that lots of great questions in the Q&A box remain unanswered, and we will try to include in our summary to reflect a lot of these questions and concerns from our online participants. We look forward to seeing you in our next program online or either in person, hopefully soon in the future. Thank you again.